Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. This is the fifth in a series of basic figure drawing lessons. So we've been building up to this stage. If you've been following the last four lessons, you'll have seen that we began with a basic gesture drawing from this reference. Then we created an articulated line drawing. Then we moved into blocking in shadow shapes. Then we turned the shadow shapes into a set of shadows on the figure with variations within the shadows, and that was last week. So this week we're going to be looking at adding tone into the halftones, into the lights essentially. So the first part of the drawing was a process of dividing the image into light shapes and dark shapes, and last week we worked in the dark shapes. This week we're going to work in the light shapes, and this is where we start to kind of develop form within the light. So there is some development of form within the shadows. Shadows tend to be a bit more unified, so you've got a fairly more like a reasonably even tone. The lights will start to look at adding some dark halftones and creating a sense of form, both in the overall figure and within individual forms. The first thing I want you to think about when blocking halftones in on figures, or anything really, is a general fall of light that will typically occur, particularly on a subject like a figure where it's quite large and there will usually be a single light source. If you imagine this figure was sitting in a life drawing room, the light source might be 2 meters up to his, sort of slightly behind him, and 2 meters up to his right. What happens when the light falls on him is that the areas of the figure closer to the light will tend to be brighter than those sections that are further away from the light, which seems reasonably logical. We call this a fall of light. So across the whole image or the whole figure, there's a fall of light, a sort of gradient that occurs simply due to the fact that certain planes are closer to the light source than other planes are. So for instance, this foot is upturned and this top plane is angling towards the light just like the shoulder is, but the shoulder is a lot closer to the light source, so the shoulder will be brighter than that halftone. So there'll be no halftones in the feet that could be as light as the halftones in the top of the figure. And this is the fall of light. So this becomes a more complex aspect of drawing, and probably next week we'll start to look at how it affects medium forms and smaller forms. But essentially what it means is that there's a kind of a gradual shift in the overall value of your halftones the further away you get from the light. So every single part of the halftone in this shoulder, as you get even to the darker halftones, they will generally be lighter than equivalent planes that face the light in the same direction on the feet. So everything becomes contextual. You have this whole figure that's being illuminated, and in the context of the shoulder, everything is brighter than the context of the foot. If you can get that accurate, if you can kind of regulate your halftones as you get further away from the light source, you'll create a better sense of voluminous light within the figure. So if you model everything individually, it feels a bit like a rendered image or kind of procedural. Whereas if you slowly control your halftones in the way that you model the values you use to model certain sections, it'll give a more kind of unified, slightly more harmonious sense to your drawing. Got a bug floating around somewhere. So, if we begin, I can demonstrate this. A warning, a kind of very early warning when it comes to adding your halftones. I would avoid adding much, if any, tone to the lighter portions of your drawing at all until everything in the darker sections has been completed. That's because it's not such a big issue when you paint, but when you draw, you don't want to have a section that should be light on the figure that is you can't erase, or if you erase it, it ruins the paper. And you'll be surprised that as you actually add all the darker halftones, there's not that much you necessarily have to do in the lights. The more that you creep into the lights, the greater the risk that you'll overmodel. Overmodeling basically means exaggerating the halftones to an extent that they kind of create a wrong sense in the image, and they make something look shiny when it should look matte. Typically the human body is reasonably matte. It does have a slight shine on it. Obviously if a body was wet or sweaty it would be shinier, so it would have a higher specularity. But generally it's a kind of fairly matte, surface, the human figure. So we don't want it to kind of get to a point where there's this really high shiny highlight on the figure. It'll look like it's made of plastic or it's a doll or something. So generally in this drawing I would be reluctant to touch anything in probably this portion of it, beyond erasing, as I was. There's a bit of sort of smudging from when we were doing the shadows, but I wouldn't add any tone until the very end, until you're pretty happy with all your other halftones and you feel like it's worth adding it. So we're going to keep that quite blown out for the time being, which means that we're going to begin by adding our darker halftones. Now the darkest halftones on this figure occur in the legs and the feet. The feet are actually quite light portions of them, just because they face up towards the sky, which means they're getting the direct light source. But there are very, very dark halftones in the legs because they're facing away from the light source, only just catching a tiny bit of it, particularly this halftone here, and they're borderline shadows. So if we begin with that halftone, I could just darken that little patch of light, keeping it separate from the shadows so it doesn't become a shadow itself, but pulling its value right down. Something like that's sufficient. So it still stands slightly separated from them, but it's pretty close, and the same goes for this leg. So I'm just going to add it as a big flat plane. And that's the other thing I want to talk about with halftones. When you first begin adding them, just like you did with the shadows, and just like you did early on in the drawing generally, you don't want to add things in a kind of overly detailed way. So you don't want to kind of start turning all these forms and making them really complex and softly shaded. Just add it as a big flat panel of value. And that means that you can add all these big flat values of value, and look at how they work together. You can lighten certain bits or darken other bits, whatever you need to do in order to get the whole drawing to fit together, but don't get caught up on individual portions. So for this leg, even though it obviously it turns in terms of form out of the shadow towards the light on the right hand side, I'm just laying it in as a general tone that suits the whole leg. Something like that gets it about right. I can then move into this other side of this leg, which is not as dark as that halftone, probably slightly lighter than the halftone on the opposite leg. So something like that's probably sufficient. And add another plane here. So as you're adding your halftones, you're adding them in a kind of three-dimensional way. You're thinking, what are the different planes, the general sort of planes that make up this figure? So it's reinforcing those things we were thinking about when we were creating the original drawing, and we were looking at overlaps and articulations, the way that shadow shapes give a sense of form, those sorts of things. Once again, we're interested in that aspect of our figure drawing. This section here's got a little connecting panel, so we'll block that in for now. As I say, you want to tend to err on the side of being slightly light, just because it's a bit easier to just add tone than it is to take it away. There's a section here as the ankle goes up into the shadow that's a little bit darker. There's some bits here as the foot turns out of that shadow. And as I say, I want to keep, even though they're quite light, I'm just going to make this foot slightly darker generally than those tones up in the shoulder, because that's going to be our lightest point. So if we go back up the leg, we can then begin by adding a general little tone. Over that leg, just to make it slightly darker than the shoulder. But then we want to look at specific tones at specific planes within the leg to start turning it. So obviously the lower part of the thigh as it turns into the shadow is not receiving as much light. And also this is an instance of it getting slightly over modelled. So I'm going to take a look at it a little bit later, this section, because I may have made it a little bit too dark generally, but we're going to see how it works relative to other tones. But for now I'm going to leave it like that, just as a general tone in that arm. This arm's slightly darker at the top, and then a lot darker as it goes down. So again, you're looking at a kind of general transition down that arm. Once again, this halftone's very dark. It's not receiving, in terms of its angle towards the light, it's not receiving much. The wrist is receiving a little bit more. You can see there's a kind of dividing point in the wrist. And then you can see the lower portion of this arm generally from the elbow point is darker. So as I say, I'm not going to do a great deal. Actually, this chest from that shadow there can darken a bit. It's quite, angle's quite far away from the light, despite being quite close to the light source. Similar for that one. A little bit of tone on that side of the hand. I'm going to keep the hand quite light because it's also receiving quite a lot of direct light. We can start to block up some planes. Probably actually generally make this leg slightly darker just because it's not quite so close to the light source, and then start to turn it from the edges. So you can see slowly, and it's quite a slow process, the form is starting to emerge. But everything's been pretty general so far, so we're not looking at specific smaller forms, we're just looking generally how these forms work. So I'm kind of looking at the leg as one big form, not necessarily all the individual muscles within the leg, or how all the transitions turn out of these shadows that we have. That'll be in a moment. We'll start to do that, and then next week we'll finish that off. But this lesson is just about blocking in halftone masses, not necessarily adding complex smaller forms. So there's a subtle piece of halftone here on the neck that occurs just because there's a slight kind of, where the shadow happens, there's a little bit of a dip away from the light source, also in this neck. And generally on kind of this side of the face, if you imagine the skull sloping up, that side of the face also starts to turn away from the light source a bit, less so in the fingers. So it'll be a little bit darker, and then we can start adding some halftone planes for the skull, the top of the skull. So that's everything roughed in, so we can sort of start to adjust those large planes now. I noticed that this one sort of stuck out as being a little bit light when I was looking at it. This one's maybe a little bit too light as well. I was just saying last week, once you start to add these halftones in, you might realise that you need to re-emphasise portions of the shadow or darken whole sections of shadow a bit in order to just generally create the correct arrangement. There's a little bit in here I just noticed that stands out as a wee bit too light. Some little planes there, sort of connecting planes that we want to start looking at. But as I say, I don't want to get too bogged down in kind of detailing these forms. That's something we'll do next week. This week we're just looking at the general sort of arrangement of tones in the halftones, rather than over detailing stuff. That's what we'll be doing soon. So at this point everything's blocked in. I want to take a little bit of time just to look at my reference and look at the drawing and just see what seems to be off, whether certain forms maybe don't work quite as well as they should. I would probably say it maybe feels like these two legs are too different from each other in my drawing, so this one's quite dark, this one's quite bright. How I would probably correct that in order to maintain the sense of general light in the shoulder would be just to go in and darken this leg generally a bit as well, with just a little kind of crossed halftone there. And I'm also thinking there must be, at this point here, it's a little bit blown out in my drawing, but there must be a sort of a point at which this leg juts out, and that would create a kind of planal change that would cause it a slightly different halftone. So something like that, I would say. And it may also mean that some of these other halftones should darken a little bit as well. But I'm definitely trying to avoid adding too many different planes. That'll be next week. We'll start to go back and correct everything. Might just do a very thin tone over the whole face and hand section up here a little bit as well, just to keep this shoulder the lightest possible part of the drawing. And I probably won't do it in while you're watching. But what I would probably also do with this drawing, just to make it really clear how the big form modelling works, is I'm going to take a little bit of time in between lessons just to add a general background tone. Because you'll notice once there's a background tone in place, the forms become a bit more naturalistic, particularly these sort of lighter forms in the top of the figure, rather than being the same value as the background with a line between them. The line becomes the border of a sort of toned background and the light of the shoulder. So you see already that starts to kind of create a better sense of form. Of form turning. And it helps us make better decisions generally about the drawing in general, I would say. It's a sort of a stylistic choice whether or not you put a background in. There's loads of really nice drawings that work without a background, but in this particular instance, because we're looking at I'm going to put it in as a bit of a ground plane. I did just say I wouldn't do this, but it didn't take too long, so I'll neaten it up a bit in between the next lesson. But you can see once I put that in place, the forms will be a bit easier to turn in the figure. But that's pretty much it for blocking in halftones. It's not a particularly complex aspect of the drawing. Everything's pretty much already roughed in. If you can get the earlier stages solid before you actually get to this point, it's not a very difficult thing to do, but that's the case with most aspects of this process, this drawing process. Nothing's too difficult if you have sort of prepared each previous stage reasonably accurately. Things only become difficult when you're sort of trying to play catch up with something that's been a mistake initially and you didn't bother to correct it or something like that. But next week's lesson we're going to be developing those forms more, both within the shadows and the lights. We've basically got to a point now where everything's in place to start developing this drawing and getting it finished pretty much. So probably maybe next lesson or 2 lessons. Possibly next lesson we'll look at medium forms, because all of these forms are large forms, so just whole legs compared to shoulders and that sort of thing. Medium forms will be creating a sort of turning form within, say, the legs muscles themselves, so the calf muscles compared with the specific forms within the knee, kind of medium small forms. And then we might have one kind of finishing lesson where we start to think artistically about how we want it to be finished, correcting anything that seems off, that sort of thing. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this portion of the drawing. So hopefully you guys have been trying to keep up with the exercise. If you have, please send through your work, and I can take a look and give you guys some advice. If you manage to get kind of work done each week, you can kind of keep up to date with it, which is really good as well. And you can sort of look forward to the next lesson. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Won't start getting into the other forms too much. But hopefully it was an interesting lesson. It's a really fun stage. It's sort of, now that everything's in place, the drawing really starts to come together, so it's very satisfying part of the drawing to work on. So hopefully you guys enjoy it. And that should do it for this week, so I'll see you guys soon.